Harmonyville is a small and cozy town located in the heart of the Midwestern United States. Picturesque streets, neat houses, and friendly residents create an atmosphere of calm and comfort. In this quiet corner, life flows smoothly, and any shocks are extremely rare here. However, the tranquility of this city was shattered by one terrible event that changed its inhabitants forever. Early one morning in early autumn, the police received an alarming call. The body of a young woman was found in one of the houses. This woman turned out to be Sarah Johnson, known in the city for her kind character and active participation in public life. Sarah was a young and beautiful woman who had just turned 32 years old. She worked as a primary school teacher and was much loved by her children and colleagues. Her life seemed cloudless. She had family, friends, and many plans for the future. Neighbors described her as open and friendly, always ready to help. The murder of Sarah Johnson came as a shock to everyone who knew her. From the very morning, the city was shrouded in anxiety and fear. No one could understand how this could happen in their quiet and peaceful town. The police immediately began an investigation, trying to quickly find the culprit and restore calm in Harmonyville. This tragedy did not leave a single resident indifferent. Sarah was known for her active position and participation in the life of the city. She organized charity events, helped those in need, and was always the life of any company. Her death left a deep wound in the hearts of those who knew her. As the city plunged into shock and grief, an active search began for evidence and witnesses. Police officers, detectives, and volunteers worked day and night to reconstruct the chain of events that led to this tragedy. Harmonyville could no longer remain the same calm place. Fear and suspicion became an integral part of it. This is how this sad story began, which became one of the most discussed and tragic in the history of Harmonyville. Early in the morning, when the town of Harmonyville was not yet fully awake, the local police department received an alarming call. The operator on the other end of the line could hear the ragged breathing and trembling voice of Sarah Johnson's neighbor, Mrs. Grace. She reported that something terrible was happening at Sarah's house. The police immediately sent a patrol car to the scene. Upon arrival, officers found a quiet house in front of them that looked completely normal and calm from the outside. However, when they went inside, the picture changed dramatically. In the living room, on the floor, they found the body of Sarah Johnson. She lay motionless, and at first glance it was clear that she had been stabbed multiple times. Blood covered the carpet and walls, creating a terrible and tragic scene. Officers immediately called in detectives and forensic experts to conduct a thorough investigation. While experts were collecting evidence, officers began interviewing neighbors and passers-by. Mrs. Grace, who first discovered the body, was in shock and could only say a few words. She said that she saw the door of Sarah's house was slightly open and, looking inside, discovered a horrifying picture. Soon, Sarah's house was filled with investigators and forensic scientists. They carefully examined every detail, every corner, trying to find even the slightest clue that could help in the investigation. Blood on the floor and walls indicated a struggle. There was an unfinished cup of tea on the kitchen table, and a book lay next to it, as if Sarah had interrupted what she was doing just a few minutes before the tragedy. Neighbors began to gather around the house, exchanging whispered guesses and rumors. Many of them could not believe what had happened. Sarah was so kind and open, always ready to help. No one could imagine that someone would want to harm her. Meanwhile, Detective Jonathan Marshall, an experienced investigator with many years of experience, took on the case. He carefully examined the crime scene, trying not to miss a single detail. His professionalism and intuition had helped him solve many difficult cases, and he was determined to find Sarah's killer. Detectives began looking into possible motives. They interviewed her friends, colleagues, and family. It soon became clear that at first glance, Sarah had no enemies. She was loved by everyone and had no conflicts either at work or in her personal life. However, it soon became clear that shortly before the murder, Sarah began to receive strange letters. These letters contained threats and strange hints about her past, which she never spoke about. Police found the letters in a desk drawer in her bedroom. This was the first serious evidence that could shed light on what was happening. Forensic scientists also found several fingerprints at the crime scene that did not belong to Sarah or her loved ones. These prints became important evidence and were immediately sent for analysis. At the same time, it was decided to conduct an extensive interview with neighbors and other possible witnesses to find out who might have come to Sarah's house in recent days. Harmonyville lived in a state of constant tension. Residents anxiously awaited news, hoping that the police would be able to quickly solve this terrible crime. Every day brought new details, new guesses, and new fears. A city that was once quiet and peaceful now finds itself at the center of one of the most notorious investigations in its history. Thus began this complex and multifaceted story, which will soon lead to amazing discoveries and unexpected turns. Detective Jonathan Marshall approached the case with the determination and professionalism that has helped him solve many difficult cases in the past. His partner, Detective Sarah Blake, joined the investigation. Sarah was an experienced investigator with a keen mind and the ability to find details that often eluded others. Together, they began by interviewing Sarah Johnson's closest neighbors and friends. Mrs. Grace, who was the first to discover the body, was called in for questioning. She was still in shock, but was able to say that the night before, she saw an unfamiliar car at Sarah's house. It was a dark sedan that had never been seen on their street before. Mr. Brown, a neighbor across the street, was next interviewed. He reported that he heard loud voices in the evening, but did not attach any importance to it. He also mentioned that he saw a man leaving Sarah's house around midnight. Mr. Brown described the man as tall, with short hair and wearing dark clothing. In parallel with this, forensic scientists continued their work at the crime scene. Fingerprints were found that did not belong to either Sarah or her immediate circle. These prints were sent for analysis in the hope that they could lead to a potential suspect. Jonathan and Sarah also discovered old photographs and letters in Sarah's bedroom, which she seemed to have carefully hidden. These letters were from one Daniel Harris, whose name did not appear in her current social circle. The letters were full of regrets and requests for forgiveness, hinting at some long-standing quarrel or tragedy. The detectives decided to find Daniel and find out what his connection to Sarah was. Their search led to a small town an hour's drive from Harmonyville, where Daniel Harris had lived for the past few years. When Jonathan and Sarah arrived at his house, he was clearly surprised by their visit. Daniel turned out to be a middle-aged man with a tired look and deep wrinkles on his face. During interrogation, Daniel said that once upon a time he and Sarah were close, but then a tragedy occurred, a car accident in which their mutual friend died. After this, their paths diverged, and for a long time he could not forgive himself for this loss. The letters he wrote to Sarah were an attempt to find comfort and forgiveness. Meanwhile, the analysis of the fingerprints gave an unexpected result. They belonged to James Carter, a man with a criminal record who lives nearby. James had a history of robbery and assault, and his record was well known to the police. He became the main suspect in the case. Detectives immediately went to James's home to question him. However, when they arrived, it turned out that he had left town shortly before Sarah was killed. This aroused suspicion, and a search was launched for him. Jonathan and Sarah began checking his connections and possible hiding places. Upon further investigation, it became clear that James Carter could not act alone. Traces of correspondence were found with a certain man named Mark, who, apparently, was his accomplice. Detectives learned that Mark was known in criminal circles as a man capable of organizing any operation and often used frontmen for his cases. Sarah Blake began looking into Mark's connections and soon discovered that he had a business connection with Linda Roberts, a well-known entrepreneur in the city. Linda owned several businesses, and her reputation was impeccable. However, behind the facade of a successful business, dark affairs were hidden. Linda was involved in money laundering and had connections to criminal elements. Jonathan and Sarah realized that the matter was much deeper than they had imagined. Now they had to not only find the killer of Sarah Johnson, but also uncover the network of criminal connections that entangled their small town. This investigation promised to be one of the most difficult in their careers, and each new step brought them closer to uncovering the truth. Harmonyville seemed to hide many secrets, and the detectives were determined to uncover them all in order to bring justice and return peace to this quiet town. The investigation into the murder of Sarah Johnson was gaining momentum. Detectives Jonathan Marshall and Sarah Blake now turned their attention to a number of suspects, any of whom could have been involved in this horrific crime. First on the list was James Carter. His fingerprints at the crime scene, as well as his criminal history, made him the prime suspect. Jonathan and Sarah learned that James had been seen in the company of dubious characters, and his connection with Mark only increased suspicion. However, his disappearance complicated the situation. Detectives continued their investigation, trying to find those who may have helped James escape. Several people came into their sight, among whom were his former cellmates and acquaintances from the criminal world. One of them, Thomas Lawson, was known for his skills in forging documents and providing shelter to fugitives. Jonathan and Sarah decide to interrogate Thomas. They arrived at his house, which was hidden in a wooded area on the outskirts of the city. Thomas, a middle-aged man with a wary look, greeted them warily, but, realizing that he had no choice, agreed to talk. He admitted that he knew James, but claimed that he had not seen him for several months. Detectives didn't take his word for it and searched his home, but found nothing suspicious. The next suspect was Linda Roberts. Despite her successful business and impeccable reputation, her connections with criminal elements left no doubt about her possible involvement. Jonathan and Sarah decided to conduct a thorough review of her financial activities and connections. During the investigation, it turned out that Linda was not only involved in money laundering, but also had personal contacts with Mark. They brought Linda in for questioning. She came to the police station with a confident look, but there was concern in her eyes. Linda denied all accusations and claimed that her relationship with Mark was purely business. However, detectives found several messages on her phone that indicated she knew about James and Mark's plans. Detectives also turned their attention to David Graham, Sarah's ex-boyfriend, from whom she broke up several years ago. David was known for his short temper and had a drinking problem. On the night of the murder, he was seen at a nearby bar, and his alibi was questionable. When Jonathan and Sarah questioned him, he appeared nervous and aggressive, but firmly maintained that he had nothing to do with the murder. However, detectives decided to continue checking him. At the same time, detectives learned of another figure who could be connected to the case, Jennifer Larson, Sarah's colleague at school. Jennifer was jealous and ambitious, and had numerous conflicts with Sarah. Colleagues described her as a person willing to do anything for her career. She often argued with Sarah on issues of the educational process and even tried to set her up in front of the management. Detectives decided to question Jennifer. She seemed calm, but her answers were too well prepared. Jonathan and Sarah felt that she was hiding something. Upon further investigation, they discovered that Jennifer had access to Sarah's personal information, including her address and schedule. This made her another serious suspect. Meanwhile, an analysis of Mark's correspondence showed that he was in contact with a certain Mike Stevens, a local entrepreneur who was known for his illegal transactions. Mike had close ties to criminal circles and may have been the one who provided the resources to plan the murder. Jonathan and Sarah decided that they needed to carefully study his activities and connections. Interrogations and investigative actions continued, and the circle of suspects expanded. Each new piece of evidence and each new information brought the detectives closer to solving this complex case. Harmonyville was filled with anxiety, but residents hoped that justice would prevail and the killer would be caught. Jonathan and Sarah continued to work day and night, sparing no effort. They knew the truth was close and were willing to do whatever it took to solve the case and bring peace back to their small town. The investigation into Sarah Johnson's murder led to significant discoveries, and the case finally went to trial. The trial was an event that attracted the attention of not only Harmonyville residents, but also people from other cities and states. Every detail, every piece of evidence was examined under a microscope. Detectives Jonathan Marshall and Sarah Blake prepared all the necessary materials for the prosecution. The main suspects were James Carter and Linda Roberts. The trial began with an opening statement from the prosecutor, who outlined all the evidence and evidence collected during the investigation. He presented James's fingerprints found at the crime scene and Linda's correspondence with Mark, indicating her possible involvement in the murder. The judge, Mr. Harrison, was known for his fairness and severity. He listened carefully to each side, giving all participants the opportunity to express their arguments. James's defense was led by lawyer Richard Kelly, an experienced and skilled lawyer who has defended some of the most difficult clients for many years. Linda was defended by lawyer Margaret Wilson, known for her aggressive tactics in court. The prosecutor was the first to call witnesses for questioning. Mrs. Grace, who first discovered Sarah's body, spoke of her experiences and details of that terrible night. Her testimony was emotional and evoked sympathy from the jury. The next witness was Mr. Brown, who saw a suspicious man outside Sarah's house. He confidently pointed to James as the man he had seen that night. Next, the prosecutor presented the results of the forensic examination. Forensic scientist Dr. Ellen Smith explained in detail how James's fingerprints were found and how they matched his samples. She also described other evidence, including signs of a struggle and blood found at the crime scene. The defense, however, was not going to give up. Defense lawyer Richard Kelly questioned the credibility of the evidence, arguing that fingerprints could have been planted. He also tried to discredit the witnesses by implying their bias and inaccuracy of recollection. Margaret Wilson defended Linda, arguing that her correspondence with Mark had nothing to do with the murder, and that all the charges against her were based on speculation and assumptions. Other witnesses were also heard during the trial. Daniel Harris has spoken about his long-term relationship with Sarah and how he tried to mend his relationship with her after the tragic accident. His testimony left the jury with mixed feelings, but it helped show that Sarah was a person who always had a lot of people around her and that she may have had hidden enemies. Detectives Jonathan and Sarah also gave evidence. They spoke in detail about the investigation, the evidence they found, and how they came to the conclusion that James and Linda were involved. Jonathan noted that this case was one of the most difficult in his career, but they are confident that they are right. The prosecutor also presented surveillance video that showed James Carter visiting Linda Roberts' home in the days before the murder. This footage became key evidence linking them together and indicating the possibility of collusion. When it was the defense's turn, James and Linda's lawyers tried to present their clients in the best light. James claimed that he was at Sarah's house to discuss his problems with her and that the murder happened after he left. Linda insisted that her criminal connections had nothing to do with the crime and that she was a victim of circumstance. The trial lasted several weeks, and every day brought new details and unexpected twists. The jury listened carefully to all testimony and analyzed the evidence presented. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, and each participant in the process felt fully responsible for their words and actions. Finally, the moment has come for final words. The prosecutor summarized all the evidence and urged the jury to reach a fair verdict based on the overwhelming evidence and testimony. He emphasized that the murder of Sarah Johnson was carefully planned and executed by James Carter with the assistance of Linda Roberts. The defense, in its closing arguments, again tried to convince the jury of its client's innocence. Kelly's lawyer argued that the investigation was biased and that James could not have committed such a crime. Margaret Wilson insisted that Linda Roberts was a scapegoat and that the real culprits were still at large. After much debate, the jury retired to reach their verdict. The waiting time was painful for all participants in the process. Finally, several hours later, they returned to the courtroom and announced their verdict. James Carter was found guilty of the murder of Sarah Johnson, and Linda Roberts was found guilty of accessory. Judge Harrison handed down harsh sentences. James Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Linda Roberts was sentenced to 20 years in prison. This verdict was the result of a long and complex investigation that shocked all of Harmonyville. Residents of the city who followed the process finally felt relief. The truth triumphed, and justice was restored. Detectives Jonathan Marshall and Sarah Blake completed their task and returned calm to their small town. However, this case left an indelible mark on their hearts, reminding them that evil can come to any home and that each of us must be ready to stand up for truth and justice. After the verdict, life in Harmonyville gradually returned to normal. But the murder of Sarah Johnson left a deep imprint on the hearts of residents. People have become more careful, attentive to their neighbors and events around them. Detectives Jonathan Marshall and Sarah Blake concluded their investigation with the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. However, they could not completely shake the feeling that there was something left unresolved in this case. Each of them understood that such matters are rarely absolutely clear and unambiguous. Harmonyville has changed. The city administration has stepped up security measures, installing additional surveillance cameras and organizing more frequent patrols. Residents actively participated in public meetings discussing how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Sarah Johnson's memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. A memorial was erected in her honor at the school where she worked. Children and colleagues often brought flowers there, remembering her kindness and care. The charity events she organized continued to be held in her memory, helping those in need and inspiring others to do good deeds. Jonathan and Sarah continued to work as police officers, but this case changed their approach to investigations forever. They became even more attentive to details and tried not to miss a single detail. Their partnership strengthened, and they became not only colleagues, but also true friends, ready to support each other in any situation. The impact of this case spread beyond Harmonyville. The media actively covered the trial and its outcome, and many people across the country learned about the tragedy of Sarah Johnson. This has led to public debate about security, justice, and the role of the police in modern society. People began to think about how important it is to be attentive and vigilant in order to prevent such tragedies. Detectives also began to share their experience with colleagues from other cities by participating in seminars and conferences. They talked about the difficulties they encountered and how they managed to overcome these difficulties. Their story became an example for other police officers, inspiring perseverance and dedication to their work. Finally, Jonathan Marshall and Sarah Blake wrote a book about the investigation of this case. They wanted people to know the truth about what happened and to understand the importance of justice and the law. The book became a bestseller, and many readers expressed gratitude for the honesty and openness with which the story was told. The story of Sarah Johnson's murder and subsequent investigation has left an indelible mark on the history of Harmonyville. It was a reminder that even in the quietest and most peaceful places, terrible things can happen, and that each of us is responsible for the safety and well-being of our community. Thus ended this sad and instructive story. She left behind many lessons and reminders about the importance of justice, vigilance, and humanity. Harmonyville, which survived this tragedy, became stronger and more united, and the memory of Sarah Johnson will forever remain in the hearts of its residents.